Good Wednesday morning, everyone. Welcome into today's daily Bible reading for December the 20th. Today we are reading together in Nehemiah chapter 13. Going to finish up our read through this text, which is the um, last historically chronological text of the Old Testament. It is um, although it's up here toward the front half of the arrangement that we have for our Old Testaments. These events are the last events we have basically before the period of silence that breaks between the events of the Old Testament and then the introduction of Jesus in the New Testament. So, what we're going to notice here, really, in chapter 13, is quite unfortunate. If I'm going to just lay it out there pretty straight, you would hope that all the work that has been done by Zerubbabel, by Ezra, and by Nehemiah and their contemporaries, by the prophets as well, you would hope that that would have led to real lasting change within Israel. But what we're going to note here in chapter 13 is the truth of the old adage: you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. Let's notice how that is the case here within Nehemiah chapter 13, beginning in verse number 1. At that time, the book of Moses was read publicly to the people. The command was found written in it that no Ammonites or Moabites should ever enter the assembly of God, because they did not meet the Israelites with food and water. Now I'm thinking, I don't think I did any highlighting within this chapter. Sorry about that. Because, verse number 2, they did not meet the Israelites with food and water. Instead, they hired Balaam against them to curse them. But our God turned the curse into a blessing. And when they heard the law, they separated all those of mixed descent. And I'm going to pause this real fast and go in here and do my highlighting real fast. I'll be back in a second. And just like that, we are back picking up in verse number 3. When they heard the law, this law concerning the fact that no Ammonites or Moabites were allowed to enter the assembly of God. When they heard the law, they separated all those of mixed descent from Israel. Now, before this, the priest Eliashib had been put in charge of the storehouses of the house of God. He was a relative of Tobiah and had prepared a large room for him where they had previously stored the grain offerings, the frankincense, the articles, and the tenths of grain, new wine, and fresh oil prescribed for the Levites, singers, and gatekeepers, along with the contributions for the priests. While all this was happening, I was not in Israel. This is Nehemiah speaking. I was not in Jerusalem, because I had returned to King Artaxerxes of Babylon in the 32nd year of his reign. It was only later that I asked the king for a leave of absence so I could return to Jerusalem. Then I discovered the evil that Eliashib had done on behalf of Tobiah by providing him a room in the courts of God's house. I was greatly displeased and threw all of Tobiah's household possessions out of the room. I ordered that the rooms be purified, and I had the articles of the house of God restored there, along with the grain offering and frankincense. I also found out that because the portions for the Levites had not been given, each of the Levites and singers performing the service had gone back to his own field. Therefore, I rebuked the officials, asking, "Why has the house of God been neglected?" I gathered the Levites and singers together and stationed them at their posts. Then all Judah brought a tenth of the grain, new wine, and fresh oil into the storehouses. I appointed as treasurers over the storehouses the priest Shelemiah, the scribe Zadok, and Pedaiah of the Levites, with Hanan, son of Zakur, son of Mattaniah, to assist them, because they were considered trustworthy. They were responsible for the distribution to their colleagues. Remember me for this, my God, and don't erase the deeds of faithful love I have done for the house of my God and for its services. At that time, I saw people in Judah treading wine presses on the Sabbath. They were also bringing in stores of grain and loading them on donkeys, along with wine, grapes, and figs. All kinds of goods were being brought to Jerusalem on the Sabbath day. So I warned them against selling on that day. The Tyrians living there were importing fish and all kinds of merchandise and selling them on the Sabbath to the people of Judah in Jerusalem. I rebuked the nobles of Judah and said to them, what is this evil you are doing, profaning the Sabbath day? Didn't your ancestors do the same, so that our God brought all this disaster on us and on this city? And now you are rekindling his anger against Israel by profaning the Sabbath. Verse 19, when shadows began to fall on the city gates of Jerusalem just before the Sabbath, I gave orders that the city gates be closed and not opened until after the Sabbath. I posted some of the men at the gates so that no goods could enter during the Sabbath day. Once or twice, the merchants and those who sell all kinds of goods camped outside Jerusalem. But I warned them, why are you coming in front of the wall? If you do it again, I'll use force against you. And after that, they did not come again on the Sabbath. Then I instructed the Levites to purify themselves and guard the city gates in order to keep the Sabbath day holy. Remember me for this, my God, and look on me with compassion according to the abundance of your faithful love. In those days, I also saw Jews who had married women from Ashdod, Ammon, and Moab. Half of their children spoke the language of Ashdod or the language of one of the other peoples, but could not speak Hebrew. I rebuked them, cursed them, beat some of their men, and pulled out their hair. I forced them to take an oath before God and said, you must not give your daughters in marriage to their sons, or take their daughters as wives for your sons or yourselves. Didn't King Solomon of Israel sin in matters like this? There was not a king like him among many nations. He was loved by his God, and God made him king over Israel. Yet foreign women drew him into evil. Why then should we hear about you doing all this terrible evil and acting unfaithfully against our God by marrying foreign women? Even one of the sons of Jehoiada, son of the high priest Eliashib, had become a son-in-law to Sanballat the Horonite. So I drove him away from me. Remember them, my God, for defiling the priesthood as well as the covenants of the priesthood and the Levites. So I purified them from everything foreign and assigned specific duties to each of the priests and Levites. I also arranged for the donation of wood at the appointed times and for the first fruits. Remember me, my God, with favor. And that is the reading of Nehemiah chapter 13 and the conclusion of our read through the text of Nehemiah. All right, so we're looking at this text here, and we're noticing again, I guess really the best way to set up this text is to remember what's come previously. So we're going back a few chapters, so probably about to chapter 8. So chapters 8 through we'll say 8 through 10 or so really focus on a commitment to the law. Remember, Ezra had this wonderful, and truly beautiful public reading of the law. And it led to a confession of the sin of the people. And it led to a rededicating of the people to the law of Yahweh. And remember, the leaders signed these various, or in verse, or in chapter 12, the leaders signed this letter of public commitment to Yahweh. So we have that backdrop, and what we're really thinking as we're reading through Nehemiah and just looking at the way it's set up, we're going to be thinking, man, everything seems to be going pretty well. It seems like the leaders are really moving the people in the right direction. It seems that like they're laying a very strong foundation for Israel to go on from here, being very faithful to God. And yet, what we're going to notice is, again, the truth of the old adage: you can lead the horse to water, but you can't make it drink. Nehemiah had done a tremendous amount of work. Ezra had done a tremendous amount of work in trying to teach the law so that the people might know it and they might apply it. I mean, even in the way this chapter begins, we have continued public reading of the law, so much so that they recognize that, oh, hey, the Ammonites and Moabites, they're not to be involved in our assemblies, in our feasts, or in our sacrifices, in our temple courts, in our worship. That they're not to be involved in these things because, according to Deuteronomy 23 and verses 3 through 5, 6, 7, something like that, they did not assist our ancestors on their pilgrimage from Egypt to the promised land. So they're not allowed to be involved in any of these assemblies. Well, big issue is that one of the priests, who's described in some places as the high priest Eliashib, he's actually allowed his relative Tobiah, who previously has given the Israelites so many issues. He basically set up for this guy an office within the temple complex, which is not okay because he's not an Israelite. And not only is he not an Israelite, but again, he's an enemy of God's people. And yet, what he did is, if I'm reading this correctly, everything that should have been stored in that room just wasn't stored. And it actually led to the beginning of verse 10, the Levites and the singers, they weren't being provided for, so they actually went back to their own land, it seems. So not only do we have Eliashib allowing a pagan to be in the temple, but he's done so to the neglect of the temple workers. You got to imagine Nehemiah is hot about this. That's one of the leaders that has really made a horrible mistake here in this moment. But here's another compounding issue. Nehemiah is not even in Jerusalem at this time. He's gone back to Babylon. Remember in chapter 2 and verse number 6, he told Artaxerxes, that I would be back by a certain time. So it seems like he's kept that promise that he has made, and he's gone back to Babylon. Yet he has to make a request to be able to come back to Jerusalem, and he does that. That's whenever he discovers all these issues of Eliashib and Tobiah. Nehemiah talks about how he was greatly displeased with what had taken place. So he goes in and basically cleans the house out for Tobiah. He cleans out Tobiah's room, throws all of his stuff out, orders that everything be purified and that everything be restored to where it needs to be, so that God's workers of his house can get back to where they need to be. Because at this point, God's house is being neglected in a real way, and he is very upset by that they are neglecting God's house, especially for a foreigner who has given them so many problems in the past, to be convenienced and have a place there. So he puts people who are trustworthy over this. And at the end of verse number 4, there's a prayer that Nehemiah offers up to God. Remember me for this, my God, and don't erase the deeds of faithful love I've done for the house of my God and for its service. Notice my faithfulness, even though they've not been faithful. Please recognize that that's not who I am, that I am focused on doing what is right. And please remember and see that. Well, then we have a second issue that happens here in beginning of verse 15, that the people, or that he saw that the people were working on the Sabbath. Not only that, but there was a bunch of business being carried out on the Sabbath. And again, there were some foreigners who were involved here. The let's see where we at. Tyrians from Tyre, Tyrians maybe, Tyrians, something like that. They were part of this business on the Sabbath day as well. And of course, this is breaking all sorts of decrees about the Sabbath and about how they were to conduct themselves, that this was supposed to be a day of rest, a day where they focused on worship, where they focused on God and not on themselves, but they turned this day into a day of great business. So Nehemiah again rebukes the nobles of Judah. Why are you doing this evil, profaning the Sabbath? Didn't you learn from our ancestors who did this? And you remember we've talked about, go back to the Chronicles, we've talked about the issues that led to our ancestors, our forefathers' downfall. Um, so don't rekindle God's anger against us by profaning his day. The very day that we are supposed to focus on him, that we're supposed to give our, excuse me, the very day that we're supposed to give our attention to him, you are just trying to make a quick buck and taking advantage of this business. So no, stop it. We're going to close the gates. I'm not going to let this happen. And so that's what he does. Closes the gates. Doesn't lets no goods come in on the Sabbath day. But he says, and verse 20 to me is actually very humorous, that once or twice the merchants and those who sell all kinds of goods would camp outside of Jerusalem. So they basically just sit there and wait to be able to do what they needed to do, or they would just be conducting themselves or conducting the business right outside the gates. So Nehemiah warned them, why are you camping in front of the wall? If you do it again, I'm basically calling the cops. I'm going to rough you up a bit. So he says they never came again on the Sabbath. And then he instructed the Levites to purify themselves and to watch the gates to make sure that the Sabbath remained holy, that it remained a special day, a day of, again, dedication to Yahweh, a day where he would be the focus, where they would take it off themselves, where they would catch their breath, have a rest, and remain holy in every way. All right, so then once again, another prayer. Remember me for this, my God, and look on me with compassion according to the abundance of your faithful love. So in those days, the text says there's this third issue that arises, where some of the Jews had intermarried with some pagans. Now, this brings us back to Ezra chapter 10, which was about 30 years prior to the events that are happening here, if my timeline is correct. And we see the main issue here being the fact, not necessarily that they just married pagans, because again, they might have proselytized, they might have come into the Jewish community and become Yahweh followers. But that's not the case. In fact, they still spoke the language of Ashdod and the language of the other peoples, but they couldn't speak Hebrew, meaning they had not assimilated into the culture of Israel and became Hebrews. That's not what they had done. They had become pagans. The influence had completely shifted in the direction of paganism and not toward that of being a Hebrew, being a part of the Jewish culture, which of course would have been built upon the Jewish religion. So again, Nehemiah is hot. He is very upset, so much so that he not only rebukes them, but he curses them. He beats some of them up, and then he pulled out their hair as well. So he really laid the hammer on them, forced them to take an oath before God. You can't do this. You can't take their daughters, and you can't give your sons to their daughters. You can't give your daughters to their sons. You can't do this. And then he specifically mentions Solomon. Don't you remember what Solomon did? That there was no king like him among the nations, that God loved him so much, that God made him king over Israel. God gave him great wisdom. God gave him great blessings. And yet foreign women drew him into sin. Why then should we hear about you doing basically the same thing? Why should you do this terrible evil? Why should you act unfaithfully in marrying these foreign women? Even, here's the kicker, even one of the sons of Jehoiada, son of the high priest Eliashib, so it seems one of Eliashib's own grandsons, had become a son-in-law to Sanballat, which was the man, again, one of Tobiah's cohorts, who had caused so many problems for the people in the rebuilding of Jerusalem's wall. So again, so many issues here being mentioned, that again, you would think that so many of the reforms, so much of the teaching from Ezra and such would have caused these things to not be the case, to not show themselves again. But again, that's just not the case. Even still, even with all the reforms, even with all the teaching, even with all the instruction, even with all the oaths, you can't force anybody to do anything. You can't force them into faithfulness. They've got to embrace that themselves. Fortunately, Israel didn't do that, which is really that these are the seeds for the unfaithfulness that we're going to see in Jesus's day, where he comes on the scene and he enacts his own reforms and begins doing his own really strong teaching in order to correct the people and to get them back in the ways of God. If you have any questions about this text here in Nehemiah chapter 13, please feel free to leave that in the comments section below. And I appreciate you so much taking some time to read along with me here on this Wednesday. Tomorrow, we're going to begin our read through Esther. We'll be reading Esther 1 and 2 tomorrow. Excuse me. And then after that, we'll begin just a chapter a day to finish out our read through for the rest of the year. We should be back on schedule at that point. Again, if you have any questions, leave those below. If you have any questions about Esther, please feel free to leave those below, and I'll see if I can focus on those specifically in my preparations for us to read through that text tomorrow. Again, thanks for tuning in. Hope you have a great rest of your Wednesday. Hope your Wednesday includes being with us tonight, if you're allowed, and of course, for our Bible study at 7 o'clock, as we'll be continuing our study on eschatology and stuff, continuing our look at amillennialism, and hopefully getting into some postmillennialism tonight as well. Really hope that we'll be able to have a good study tonight. Hope that we'll see you then, or wherever you might be at. Hope that you'll be able to gather with God's people if that's an opportunity that you have this evening. Again, thanks for tuning in. Have a great rest of your Wednesday. Take care, and God bless.